Some people knock on a door because they want something. She didn't knock at all. I found her sitting against my well in the gray hour before sunrise, so still that for one cold second I thought the desert had finally left a dead thing on my land the way it leaves bleached bones and rusted wagon wheels. Her hands were folded in her lap like she was waiting for a train that was never coming. And when she lifted her head and looked at me, not afraid, not begging, just tired in a way that goes past the body and down into the soul, I forgot every hard word I'd rehearsed for trespassers. I'm going to tell you what happened after that. All of it. The parts that made the whole valley talk and the parts I never told a living person, because some of them still shame me and some of them I'm not sure I deserve to keep. I'll tell you now before we start that I got a lot of it wrong. I want you to watch me get it wrong. Because the only thing I did right, the one thing, is that I didn't turn her away in that first hour when it would have been so easy, so sensible, so much what everybody expected of a man like me. Stay with me. This isn't a story about a man who saved a woman. It's about a woman who arrived carrying every kind of loss a person can carry, and who, without ever meaning to, saved a man who thought he'd already buried everything worth having. Her name I'll get to. My name is Silas Boone, and this is the winter she came. The dog knew before I did. Old Cutter never barked at nothing. He was a lazy, half-deaf blue heeler with one milky eye and a tail that had quit wagging around the same year my wife stopped breathing, and if he lifted his head off the porch boards, it meant something in this world had changed its mind about staying still. That morning he was standing at the top of the porch steps with his hackles up and a low sound in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, more like a question. "What is it, you old fool?" I muttered, and reached for the rifle by the door out of pure habit, the way another man might reach for his hat. I keep a ledger, you should know. Little black book, cracked spine, kept it since I was 19. My father raised me to believe a man's whole worth could be written in 2 columns, what's owed to him and what he owes. He kept his square to the penny his entire life and died with the book balanced and his heart empty, and I loved him and I have spent 40 years trying to be less like him and failing. But the ledger stayed. I wrote in it every night. Fence post replaced North 40. 2 hens took by coyote. O'Holly's at the mercantile $4.10. Small sums. A small life tallied. I mention it now because I want you to understand exactly what kind of man walked out to that well. A counting man. A closed account man. A man who had, in the honest arithmetic of his own soul, written himself off. The frost was on everything. The Gila country doesn't get pretty snow like they get up north. It gets a mean, thin cold that finds the gaps in your coat and settles in your knees. And that morning the ground crackled under my boots like the whole earth was made of eggshell. The sky was that bruised color it gets right before the sun bothers to show up. And there she was. She had her back against the stone lip of the well, knees drawn partway up, wrapped in a blanket that had once been red and was now the color of old blood and dust. Long dark hair, loose, frozen a little at the ends where her breath had caught in it through the night. She wasn't wearing enough to be sitting out in that cold. Nobody was. Her feet, she had a pair of worn moccasins and one of them had come half off, and I could see her heel, cracked and gray with cold, and something in my chest did a thing it hadn't done in a long time. I stopped maybe 15 feet off. The rifle was in my hand but pointed at the dirt, and I want to be truthful, I don't fully know, even now, whether I meant to raise it or not. In that country in that year, a lot of men would have. There'd been raids up and down the territory, real ones and made-up ones, and the newspapers printed both the same size so a scared man couldn't tell the difference. I'd lost a neighbor's boy to the fear more than to any actual danger. Kid shot a shadow one night, and the shadow turned out to be his own uncle come home late. So I know what I was supposed to feel. What I actually felt, God help me, was that I was looking at grief wearing a body. I'd seen it before. I'd worn it myself in the mirror the year Ruth died. That particular stillness. That way a person sits when they've stopped expecting anything good and are simply waiting to see what the world takes next. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark and steady, and there wasn't one drop of pleading in them. That's what undid me, I think. If she'd cried, if she'd reached out a hand, I might have, I don't know. But she just looked at me the way you'd look at weather. Like I was a thing that would do what it would do, and she had run clean out of the strength to argue with any of it. "You're on my land," I said. Stupid, first thing out of my mouth. The counting man defending his column. She didn't answer. I couldn't tell if she understood the words or simply didn't think they were worth the breath. Her jaw was set. Not defiant, exactly. More like a person holding something together by sheer refusal to let it fall apart in front of a stranger. Cutter came off the porch. That surprised me more than anything. That dog hadn't voluntarily walked toward a person, not me, in 3 years, and he crossed that frozen yard stiff-legged and slow and went right up to her and pushed his gray muzzle against her folded hands. And she flinched, just slightly. Then her fingers moved and she laid one hand flat on the top of his old head and she closed her eyes. And a single tear came down. One. She didn't make a sound. She didn't wipe it. It just ran down through the dust on her face and dropped off her jaw, and I stood there like a fence post watching a woman I'd never met be comforted by my miserable dog, and I felt every hard, sensible, self-protecting plan I'd made for such a moment crumble like a dirt clod in the wind. I lowered the rifle the rest of the way and set it leaning against the well. "You'll freeze out here," I said. My voice came out rough. "There's a fire inside, coffee if you want it. You don't have to, I'm not going to." I didn't know how to finish it. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to turn you in. I'm not going to be one more thing that takes from you." All of it was true and none of it would fit in my mouth. She opened her eyes and looked at me for a long moment, measuring. Then she looked at the house, at the smoke coming thin from the chimney, and I watched her do arithmetic of her own. The arithmetic of a woman deciding whether the danger of a strange man's fire was worse than the certainty of the cold. The cold one, or maybe the dog one. She let Cutter's head go, gathered the blanket, and got to her feet, and I saw her sway, saw how weak she was, and I stepped forward on instinct and she went rigid and I stopped dead. Held my hands up empty. "All right," I said. "All right, you walk your own self then, I'll go on ahead." And I did. I turned my back on a stranger on my own land. The exact thing my father would have called a fool's move. The exact thing that gets a man killed in the stories. And I walked to my own front door and held it open and waited. It took her a while to cross that yard. She stopped twice. I didn't rush her. When she finally came up the steps, she paused at the threshold like there was a line drawn there only she could see, and she looked at me one more time, hard, and I understood she was giving me a chance to be honest, to show a hidden intention if I had one. I stepped back to let her pass with room to spare, didn't crowd the door. She came in. I have thought about that morning more times than I can count, and I have never been able to decide whether I did a good thing or simply a soft thing that happened to turn out well. There's a difference. Good is when you know the cost and pay it anyway. Soft is when you don't think it through and get lucky. I've been called both in my life, and I've usually deserved the second. Inside, she stood with her back to the wall, the whole wall, so nothing could come at her from behind, and she could see the door, and she watched me the entire time I built up the fire and set the coffee. I moved slow, narrated everything dumb as it sounds. Putting more wood on, that's just the pot. I'm going to hang this here. Like gentling a spooked horse. Maybe that's exactly what it was. She wouldn't sit until I sat first, and then only in the chair nearest the door, and she kept the blanket around her. And when I set the coffee down within her reach, she didn't touch it until the steam had died halfway, and even then she smelled it before she drank. I don't blame her one bit. She'd learned somewhere, hard, that the hand offering you something is the same hand that can close around your throat. I didn't ask her name, Didn't ask where she came from or what happened or where the rest of her people were, or any of the questions that were stacked up behind my teeth. I have a talent for the wrong words and I knew it, so I said nothing. I drank my coffee. I looked at the fire. I let the warmth do its slow work on the both of us. Cutter lay down between us, which he never did. After a long time she spoke. Her English was careful, accented, but clear, clearer than I expected, which told me she'd lived near enough to white folks long enough to have had reason to learn it, and that was its own sad story I'd get pieces of later. "You are not afraid of me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was almost an accusation, like she'd been counting on my fear to know how to survive me, and its absence left her without a map. "No, ma'am," I said. "I don't guess I am." "Everyone is afraid," she said it flat, old knowledge, or they pretend so they can do what fear lets them do. I turned that over. It was, I realized, the truest thing anyone had said in my kitchen in years. "I've been afraid most of my life," I told her. "Different things. Never much been afraid of a person too worn out to lift a coffee cup. I regretted it the second it left me, too plain, too near the bone. But something in her face eased a fraction, like the plainness was a relief after a lifetime of men saying the opposite of what they meant. She drank the coffee then, all of it, and I saw her hands were shaking and not just from cold. I got up slow and told her I was going to fix some food, and I did beans and the last of the salt pork and cornbread I'd made 2 days back, nothing worth bragging on. I set it in front of her and went back to my side and ate my own so she could see it came from the same pot, and she ate like a person who has learned not to trust the next meal to come, careful and fast at the same time. And when it was gone, she looked at the empty plate, and then she put her face in her hands. Not crying, worse than crying, that dry, silent shaking that comes when a body has gone past tears into something with no name. I didn't move to her. I didn't say they're there. I have never in my life known what to do with another person's grief except sit inside the same room with it and refuse to leave. So that's what I did. I sat. Cutter put his head on her foot. The fire popped. Outside, the sun finally came up over the ridge, throwing a hard gold light through the window, and it lit the dust in the air and it lit the side of her bowed head, and I thought, without wanting to, of Ruth. Of the morning I'd sat exactly where that woman was sitting, in exactly that light, the day after we buried her, and how the worst part hadn't been the missing. The worst part had been that the sun kept coming up like nothing had ended. "You can rest here," I heard myself say. "Long as you need. Nobody comes out this far, and I've got a lean-to room dry with a door that latches from the inside. I'll show you the latch. It's yours to lock." She lowered her hands, looked at me with those steady dark eyes, wet now but steady. "Why?" she said. And I want to tell you I had some fine answer. Some noble thing about mercy or God or the milk of human kindness. I didn't. What I had was 40 years of a ledger with nothing in the owed to me column that mattered, and a whole life of small sums adding up to a small empty house, and a dog that had chosen her, and a light coming through a window that had once lit my whole reason for living and had shone on nothing worth nomming since. "Because I've got room," I said finally, "in the house and otherwise, and it's been empty a long while." She looked at me a long, long time, and I understood that this was the real threshold, the one that had nothing to do with the door. She was deciding whether to believe me, whether the risk of believing was one she could survive if she was wrong. "I will work," she said at last, fierce, sudden. I do not take charity." The word came out like it tasted foul. "I will earn what I eat. I will earn the roof. When I am strong I will go. You understand this. I owe you nothing. This is not," she stopped, hunting the word, and found it, and it landed like a stone. "This is not a kindness I asked for." "No," I agreed. "It ain't. And you don't owe me a thing." I meant it. "But if you want to work, I've got more work than one broke-down old man can do, and that's God's honest truth. So we'll call it a fair trade, and neither one of us has to feel like a beggar. That suits you." Something in her shoulders came down half an inch. That suits me, she said. I showed her the latch. She locked it that first night and the second and the third. I heard it click every evening through the wall, and I'm not too proud to say the sound hurt me a little each time, and I'm also not fool enough to think she was wrong. It was a full 2 weeks before I stopped hearing the latch. I didn't say anything about it. Some things you don't say. You just notice, and you're grateful, and you write it in a different kind of ledger, the kind with no column headings, the kind I was only then learning I'd been keeping my whole life without knowing. I'll give you her name now, because she gave it to me the way she gave me everything slow, and only once she decided I'd earned it. For a long time I just called her Nothing. She called me nothing back. We were two people sharing chores in silence. She was, I learned fast, a better hand than most men I'd hired. She could mend a fence tighter than me. She knew things about the land I'd farmed for 20 years that I'd never bothered to learn, which plants pulled water up to the surface, which stretch of the wash flooded and which held, how to read the coming weather in the way the birds moved. She'd catch me watching her work and go still and wary, and I'd go back to my own task quick, because the last thing I wanted was for her to feel like a thing on display. The valley found out, of course. It always does. Holly's at the mercantile heard it from the freight driver who'd seen smoke and two figures at my place. And Holly's told Deacon Prout, and Prout was the kind of righteous that curdles, and inside of 3 weeks I had visitors. They came on a Sunday afternoon. Prout and two others on horseback, all of them wearing that particular expression of men who have come to do you a favor you didn't ask for. She was out at the barn. I met them in the yard and didn't invite them down off their horses. Silas, Prout said, there's talk. There's always talk, I said. You want coffee or you want to say your piece from up there and ride on. He didn't like that. There's an Apache woman living on your place. There's a woman working my place, earning her keep, same as I'd hire any hand. You know what I mean. He leaned on his saddle horn. After Cochise, after all of it, folks are jumpy, Silas. There's women in this valley scared to sleep. A man of your standing keeping one of them. One of them, I repeated. You know what those people did to the Harlow family. You know it plain as I do. I did know. I knew about the Harlows, and I knew about other families too, and I knew because I was not a stupid man, only a slow-changing one. I knew about the Camp Grant massacre, where 100 and more Apache women and children got cut down in their sleep by men from this very territory who then went home to Sunday dinner and called themselves protectors. I knew that what those people did was a book with pages written by both hands, and that most men in the valley only ever read the half that let them sleep. But I hadn't known I knew all that until Prout sat up on his horse asking me to be afraid, and I found out I wasn't going to be. She lost everything, I said. I don't know all of it, I don't ask, but I've seen enough grief to know it when it's sitting in my kitchen and she's got it in a size I've only worn once. Now, she hasn't touched a soul. She works harder than your boys and mine put together. And she's on my land, which last I checked was still mine, bought and paid and taxed. It's not about your land. It's about the safety of this. Deacon. I stepped closer to his horse and lowered my voice, and I have never in my life been a hard man, but I found some hard right then. You came out here to tell me you're scared. All right. You're scared. I heard you, but you don't get to make her pay for your fear. She's paid enough. And if you or anybody rides out here to do her harm, you'll find me between you and her, and I have got very little left to lose and a great deal of ammunition. Now that's my piece. Ride on. The silence stretched. One of the men behind Prout shifted his hand toward his coat, and I saw it. And Cutter, that old dog, came off the porch snarling for real this time, and I did not move and I did not blink. Prout looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked past me, and I turned my head just enough to see that she had come out of the barn and was standing there, still, watching, a length of fence wire in her hands held loose but ready, and her face was carved out of the same stone as the mountains behind her. You'll answer for this, Prout said to me, but looking at her, one way or another. I answer for everything, I said, Been doing it my whole life. Go home to your supper." They went. I stood in the yard until the dust settled and my heart quit hammering, and when I turned around she was still there, and the wire was still in her hands, and she was looking at me like she'd never seen me before, like I'd rearranged into a different shape. "You made an enemy," she said. "For me, a stranger." "I made an enemy of a bully," I said. "That's just Tuesday." She didn't smile. She wasn't a woman who smiled easy, and I'd learned it meant something enormous the day she finally did. But she set the wire down slow, and she came a few steps closer than she'd ever willingly stood, and she said a word I didn't understand, soft in her own tongue. And then she said in mine, "Deganawida," she touched her own chest. "It is close. In your mouth it will break, but it is what I am called by the ones who loved me." A pause, her jaw worked. Who love, and she couldn't finish it, the tense, the terrible tense of it, whether they were still living to love her or only had, and I understood that in that one broken verb was the entire shape of what she'd lost. "I won't try to say it and mangle it," I told her gently, "but I'll hold it. It's a good name." "You may call me," she considered, choosing what to give a man she was only beginning to trust with the smallest true thing. "Nita, it is a peace. It is enough for now." "Nita," I said, "I'm honored." And she looked at me and something crossed her face, not the smile, not yet, but the ground it would one day grow from, and she said, "You are strange, Sela's boon." "I've been told," I said. "Come on, it's cold, there's stew." She latched her door that night, too. But when I passed it later, on my way to bank the fire, I heard her voice through the wood, low, in her own language, that same rising and falling shape a person makes when they're praying or grieving or both. And then in English, so soft I might have dreamed it, I heard her say a name that wasn't hers. A child's name, by the sound. Said the way you say a name you'll never get to call across a yard again. I stood in the dark hallway of my own house, and I put my hand flat against her door, not to open it, just to be near the sound, the way you'd warm your hand at a fire you can't get any closer to. And I made her a promise she couldn't hear and hadn't asked for, and I had no right to make. Whatever you lost, I thought, I can't give it back. God knows I couldn't even keep my own, but I can make sure you're not alone while you carry it. That much I can do. That much I will do if it's the last useful thing I'm good for. I went to my ledger that night out of 40 years of habit, opened the little black book, picked up the pencil. And for the first time in my life I sat there, and I couldn't think of a single thing to write in either column that meant anything at all. Fence posts, hens, debts of $4.10. It was all suddenly the accounting of a man who'd been measuring the wrong things his entire life. I closed the book. I never wrote in it again. That was the first month. The cold month. I've gone slow through it on purpose because everything that came after, the spring, the trouble with Prute that didn't stay just talk, the day I learned exactly what she'd lost and how, the child, and the choice that came at the end of it that split me right down the middle, and that I still don't know if I got right. All of that grew out of these first weeks, out of a stranger at a well and a man who forgot to be afraid. I told you at the start I got a lot wrong. I did. There's a thing I said to her, come February, that I'd give 10 years off my life to take back. There's a moment I hesitated when I shouldn't have, and it cost us both dear. But I'll get to that. For now I want to leave us here, in the warm kitchen in the cold winter, a strange man and a grieving woman and an old dog between them, and the fire holding back the dark, and a name, Nita, a peace, enough for now, laid down on the table between us like the first coin in a new kind of ledger. The kind you don't keep to balance. The kind you keep to remember you were, once, not alone. She'd been keeping her door latched. I didn't know yet that the day she stopped would be one of the best days of my life. Or that it would come right before the worst. The day she stopped latching her door, I found out why she'd started. It was late January, the cold beginning to lose its teeth, and I woke before light the way I always do and heard something I hadn't heard in that house since Ruth, the sound of someone else moving through it easy. Not creeping, not braced. Just a person walking to the stove because it was cold and the fire wanted feeding, the door to the linta standing open behind her, unlatched, forgotten. I lay in my bed and listened to Nita build up my fire, and I understood that a wall between us had come down in the night without either of us saying a word about it, and I found I had to put my forearm over my eyes for a minute before I could get up and be a person about it. We'd fallen into a shape by then. She worked the land like it was an argument she meant to win. I did the heavy hauling and the trips to town, and the 100 small repairs a place like mine always needs. In the evenings we ate at the same table and mostly didn't talk, and the not talking had turned from offense into a kind of company. Cutter had picked his person, and it wasn't me anymore, the traitor, and I didn't mind one bit. He slept across her threshold now like he'd appointed himself. She gave me her past the way she'd given me her name. In pieces. Never when I asked. I'd stopped asking early, and I think that's the only reason she ever told me anything. A person who's had everything taken doesn't hand you the last of it because you demanded it. They hand it to you because one evening the fire is low and the silence is safe, and it just comes. Here is what I learned over that winter, in pieces I've since fit together. She had been married. His name I won't write because she said it only once and it cost her too much and it isn't mine to spend. He had been a good man, she said, in a tone that told me good was a word she'd tested against a hard life and found held true. They had lived at San Carlos, the reservation, the agency, and if you don't know what San Carlos was in those years, I'll tell you plain. It was a place the government herded people to die slow. Hellsforty, some of the soldiers themselves called it. Bad water, bad rations when there were rations, fever in the hot months that took the old and the small first. They'd been promised food and got weevils, promised safety and got a fence. She'd had a daughter. I knew it before she said it. I'd known there was a child from the first night, from the name through the door. But knowing a thing and hearing a mother say it out loud are different countries. The girl's name was Sona. She was 6 the last summer. Nita told me about her the way you'd tell someone about a color they'd never seen, helpless, reaching for words that wouldn't reach. Sona laughed at everything. Sona was afraid of the big black ravens and would run to hide her face in her mother's skirt, and Nita would tell her the ravens were just old men complaining about their knees, and Sona would peek out and laugh. Sona had a way of falling asleep sitting up, mid-sentence, like she couldn't bear to miss a moment and lost the fight every night. The fever came in the worst of the summer. It took Sona in 4 days. And here is the part that Nita told me with no tears at all, which is how I knew it was the part that had actually killed something in her. The agency doctor had medicine. He had it, but it was rationed, and the ration went to the families the agent favored, the ones who'd made themselves useful or quiet, and Nita's husband had made himself neither. He'd been one who spoke up, who counted the short rations out loud where others could hear, who wrote to people back east that nobody answered. So when Nita carried her burning child 3 miles to the agency and begged, the doctor looked at his list and at his shelf and at the man standing behind her that he'd been told to punish, and he closed the box. He closed the box. I've hated a great many things in my life in the ordinary way. A man hates weather and taxes and his own failures. I had never, until Nita told me that, hated a man I'd never met with a cold, clean fury that scared me. She saw it in my face and she said, tired, do not. It does no good. I have carried the hate. It is heavier than the grief. Do not pick it up. Her husband died that winter. Not of fever. Of the thing that comes after when a strong man has had his child taken by a closed box and his voice taken by men who feed on quiet. He'd gone out with a few others, gone off the reservation without leave, and the how of his dying she never gave me and I never asked. But I understood it was violent, and I understood she blamed the box for that too, the same closed box, reaching forward in time to take the second thing. And then it was just her. On a reservation that was a slow death, among people grinding down to nothing, with 2 graves and no reason left to stay chained to the ground that held them. So she walked off. She walked off San Carlos with a blanket and a knife, and nothing else. Walked through country that would kill a soft person in a day. Walked away from the graves because staying near them was killing her faster than the walking might. And she walked with no destination, no plan, only the animal need to be somewhere that wasn't there. Until one gray morning her legs quit at the edge of a stranger's land, at the lip of a stranger's well, and she sat down to wait for whatever came next, too worn even to want it to be mercy. That was the woman I'd found. Not a mystery, not a danger. A mother who had buried her whole world and kept walking because her body hadn't gotten the message yet that there was nothing left to walk toward. When she finished telling me, over 3 or 4 nights it took, in pieces, she looked at me across the fire and said, "Now you know. Now you may be afraid of me correctly. I am not dangerous. I am only ruined." "You're not ruined," I said, and my voice cracked doing it. "You do not know what ruined is. I know I buried my wife and half of myself with her and then spent 5 years thinking I was ruined too. And I know that I look at you working my fence like you mean to teach it a lesson, and I don't see ruined. I see somebody the world tried its level best to break and couldn't finish the job." I leaned forward. "You walked off a place that killed everyone you loved. Nita, that's not ruin. That's the opposite. That's the most stubborn, alive thing I ever heard." She looked at me for a long time. And then there it was. The smile. Small and sad and gone in a second, but real, the first true smile I'd seen on her, and I swear to you it lit that room brighter than the fire did, and I had to look away because a man can only stand so much at once. "You talk too much, Silas Boone," she said. "So I'm told. That was a good winter. I need you to know that before I tell you the rest. It was, for a while, the best I'd had since Ruth. 2 ruined people unruining each other by degrees, over stew and silence and fence wire with an old dog to referee. If the story had ended there, I'd have called it a full life. It didn't end there. I told you in part 1 that I said a thing to her come February that I'd give 10 years to take back. Here it is. I've owed you this." It was a raw, wet evening, and I'd come back from town in a black mood. In town, they'd all but stopped serving me. Holly still would, out of old friendship, but he did it quiet and quick like a man passing you something shameful. Prute had been working the valley. There was a paper going around, a petition, if you can feature it, a petition to have the Apache woman reported to the agency and sent back to San Carlos on grounds of public safety, signed by good Christian men and women who'd never laid eyes on her. Holly showed it to me under the counter. There were a lot of names on it. I came home wet and beaten and small, and Nita took one look at me and asked what happened, and I didn't want to tell her about the petition, so I didn't, and she pressed, gently, but she pressed, because by then she'd earned the right and I was tired and mean and frightened, and I said, "Maybe it'd be easier for the both of us if you'd never sat down at that well." I saw it land. I saw it go into her like the knife she carried. She went absolutely still, and then she nodded once, slow, like a person receiving a sentence they'd always expected, and she said, "Yes, I have thought this also," and she got up and went into the lean-to and shut the door. She latched it. For the first time in a month, she latched it. And I sat at my table in my black wet mood, and I heard that latch click, and I understood exactly what I'd done. I told a woman who'd been discarded by everyone and everything that she was, after all, just a burden, the one thing she'd fought hardest not to be, the thing she'd sworn at my own fire she would never let herself become. She'd said it that first day, "I do not take. I am not a charity. This is not a kindness I asked for." And I just proved, in one tired, mean breath, that her whole struggle to earn her place had bought her nothing. That in the end I saw her the way the petition saw her, as a problem to be easier without. I didn't even mean it. That's the worst part. It wasn't true. I meant that I was scared and I hated the town and I felt helpless, and it came out of me pointed at the one person who'd done nothing but make my life larger, because she was the only one safe enough to be cruel to, And that is the oldest and lowest thing a small, frightened man does, and I did it. I stood at her door for an hour. I didn't knock. I didn't have the right, and knocking would have been for me, not her, to ease my own guilt by making her comfort me. So I just stood there, the way I'd stood there the first night, hand flat against the wood, and after a long while I said, quiet, I lied. What I said. It's the biggest lie I ever told, and I told it because I'm a coward and I'm scared for you, and I turned it into being scared of you, and that was wrong. You sitting down at that well is the best thing that ever happened to this place. To me. I'd do the whole winter over 100 times to keep it. I'm sorry. You don't have to answer. I just needed you to hear the truth said out loud through the door where it was born. She didn't answer. I hadn't expected her to. I went to bed feeling like the worst man in the territory, which I probably was. In the morning her door was open. She was at the stove. She didn't look at me and I didn't push it, and we worked the day in a silence that was a fence again and not a company, and it hurt, and I let it hurt because I'd earned it. It took her 4 days to forgive me. On the 4th night she set my supper down, and instead of taking her own seat, she stood over me a moment and said, "My husband once said a cruel thing to me. From fear, as you did," she let that sit. "I made him carry it 3 days. You I made carry 4 because you are more stubborn and needed the extra." And then, mercy of mercies, the smile. "We are finished with it now. Do not do it again. I have buried too many things. I will not bury this too, and I will not let you make me want to. I have been forgiven a few times in my life by God and men. That's the only one I ever felt in my chest like a struck bell." Spring came, and with it, the trouble stopped being talk. It was a night in April. I'd like to say I saw it coming, but I didn't, not really. I'd let myself believe the petition was the worst of it, that Prout's kind bled off their meanness into paper and self-righteousness, and stopped there. I'd forgotten that fear that can't get what it wants on paper goes looking for it in the dark. They came at night. 4 of them, maybe 5. I never got a clean count. Not Prout himself. Prout was the kind who lit the fire and stayed home clean. These were younger, drunker, the valley's supply of frightened men who'd been told all winter that there was a danger out at Boone's place and that no one would stop them from handling it. Cutter woke us. That old deaf dog, he felt them before he heard them, and he came off Nita's threshold roaring in a way I'd never heard, and I was up and had the rifle before my mind had caught up with my hands. Nita was up too, fast, the knife already in her fist, her back to the wall, her whole body gone into that stillness I'd seen the first morning, the stillness of a person who has survived worse and knows exactly how much it costs. "Stay inside," I told her. "Whatever happens, stay in and keep the door." "No," she said. "Nita." "I have hidden behind a door while men decided my life," she said, low and terrible. "Once. I will not do it twice. If they come, they will see me standing." There was no arguing it. There wasn't time. They'd fired the barn. That's what they'd come to do first, smoke us, panic us, drive us out into the yard where they waited. The light of it came orange through the window, and I heard the horses screaming, and something in me went cold and clear the way it does when the worst is finally, actually here, and there's nothing left but to meet it. I want to tell you I was brave. The truth is closer to this. I was a 50-year-old rancher with a good rifle and a lifetime of not much left to lose, and I stepped out onto my porch into the light of my burning barn, and I put the rifle to my shoulder and I said, loud, "First man to come past the well is the first man I bury. I've got no family to grieve me and I'm a hell of a shot. Ask yourselves if you feel that lucky." For a moment it held. For a moment my empty life was actually a weapon. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in any yard, and they knew it, and they hesitated. And here is the hesitation that cost us. Mine, not theirs. Because there was a shape at the edge of the firelight, moving toward the corral where my horses were penned and screaming, and my first thought, God forgive me, my trained, valley-poisoned first thought, was raider, flank, they're circling. And I swung the rifle toward that shape and my finger took up the slack on the trigger. And it was Nita. She'd gone out the back. She wasn't hiding and she wasn't fighting the men. She'd gone to free the horses, to save the animals from the fire while I stood on the porch making speeches. That was her, in the smoke, doing the useful brave thing while I did the loud one. And I had my rifle on her and my finger on the trigger, and for 1/2 of 1 second I did not know her. I didn't fire. I want to be clear. I did not fire. But the hesitation, the fact that my body had swung the gun toward the one person in that yard I'd have died for, the fact that even for 1/2 second the poison in the air had turned her into a shape to shoot. I felt that 1/2 second go all the way down into the deepest part of me, and I have never gotten it fully back out. The horses came bursting out of the corral where she'd thrown the gate, and they went through the yard like a flood, right through the middle of those drunk, frightened men. And in the chaos of it, the fire, the horses, the roaring dog, the old man on the porch with the rifle, and a woman standing straight-backed in the smoke refusing to be afraid, the whole cowardly thing came apart. You cannot burn a family out of their home when the home fights back and the animals stampede and the man means his threat. One of them fired wild. The bullet took a chunk out of my porch post a foot from my head. I fired back once over their heads, not to kill. I found, in the moment, I didn't want to kill even them. And the sound of it and the horses and the collapsing barn was too much for men who'd come expecting to frighten and instead got frightened. And they broke and ran for their mounts and were gone into the dark, and it was over almost as fast as it began. The barn was a loss. We got it half controlled and let the rest burn down safe, the two of us hauling water till dawn, black with soot, Cutter limping. He'd taken a kick in the melee and would limp the rest of his short life for it. But we were alive. The house stood. The horses, most of them, came back at first light the way horses do. And in the gray of that morning, the same gray hour she'd first arrived in, I noticed, the whole thing come full circle. We sat on the porch steps too exhausted to move, and I told her. I made myself tell her. I had the rifle on you, I said. In the smoke. 1/2 second. I didn't know you and I had my gun on you and my finger on the trigger. I need you to know that. Because I promised myself I'd never lie to you again, not even the lie of leaving a thing out. She was quiet a long while. I know, she said. I saw. You saw. I saw the gun move. She looked out at the smoking ruin of the barn. And I saw you not fire. A worse man fires. A man full of the poison fires and calls it a mistake and sleeps fine. She turned and looked at me, soot-streaked, hollow-eyed, and utterly without accusation. You are not free of the poison, no one here is. It is in the water of this whole country, but you felt it and you did not obey it. That is all any of us can do, Silas, feel it and not obey it. She looked back at the barn. The doctor obeyed it, and my daughter is dead. You did not obey it, and I am alive on your porch. This is the only difference that has ever mattered in my whole life. It is a small difference. It is the only one there is. I have turned that over for the rest of my days, and I have never found the bottom of it. Feel it and don't obey it. She'd handed me, in the ashes of my own barn, the closest thing to wisdom I've ever been given, and she'd paid for it with a life I'd never be able to imagine the weight of. Now here's the ending. And I told you at the start it wouldn't be neat, and it isn't, and I've made my peace with that the way you make peace with a scar. You stop expecting it to be skin again. Valley after the barn split. That's the thing about a coward's fire. It shows everybody the color of everybody else. Some folks who'd signed the petition were horrified to learn what their fear had grown into in the dark, and they actually came out, on their own horses, shamefaced, and helped us raise a new barn that summer. Holly's first among them. There were others in that valley all along who'd kept quiet, and the fire made a few of them quit being quiet, and that's the small good that came of it. Not a lot, some. Prout left the county by fall. Not run out, nothing so satisfying. Just quietly moved on to a place that didn't know him, the way that kind always does, to be righteous somewhere fresh. And Nita. I'd offered her a family. That was the true thing under everything, the offer I'd made without words that first cold morning and every day after. Not a wife. I never presumed it, and I'll tell you plain it was never that between us, or not simply that. It was something both smaller and larger, something the language I've got doesn't have a good word for. Two people who'd each lost their whole family and decided, without ever quite saying it, to be one for each other. A made thing. A chosen thing. The kind you don't inherit and can't bury, because you build it new every single day it exists. For 2 years, that's what we were. The best 2 years of my life, bar the ones with Ruth, and some days I'm not even sure I'd rank them second. Then one spring, a man came up the road. A Chiricahua man, older, with news that had traveled a long way by the slow underground routes news travels among a scattered and hunted people. He'd been looking a long time. He carried word that some of Nita's people, not her husband, not Sona, those were gone forever, but her mother's sister and 2 cousins and their children, a fragment of the family she'd thought entirely erased, had survived, were living. Far off in the mountains, in the hard, free, brutal remnant of a life the government hadn't finished stamping out yet. And they were sending word down every road they knew in case. If she lives, tell her we live. Tell her to come. She stood in my yard holding that news the way she'd held the coffee that first morning, not trusting it, smelling it before she'd let herself drink. And then she looked at me. And I knew. I'd known before she did, maybe. I knew the way you know the frost is coming from the way the light lies down in the evening. She was asking me, with her eyes, because she'd never have asked it with her mouth. She'd never take that much. She was asking me if it was all right to want to go. If leaving the family we'd made was a betrayal of it. If choosing the blood that survived over the man who'd sat with her in the ashes made her the thing she'd sworn never to be, someone who took and left. Here was my heavy decision, the heaviest of my life. I'd like to tell you I met it clean. I didn't. Everything in me, every selfish, frightened, lonely part, the whole of the small counting man I'd been before her, everything in me wanted to say stay. I had it in my mouth. Stay. What if it's not true? What if they're gone by the time you get there? What if the road kills you? You're safe here. You're wanted here. Don't leave me back in the empty house. Stay. I felt it, all of it. Every word of it true and every word of it poison. And I did not obey it. Go, I said. God, Nita, go fast before the season turns. Take the roan, she's the strongest, and I'll load you enough to get there and then some, and you go and you find them, and you don't look back at this place for 1 second, you hear me? You don't owe this place a backward look. You've paid it in full and then some. She was crying. She never cried. I'd seen it exactly twice in over 2 years, and she was crying now, and so was I. The both of us standing in the yard blubbering like fools, while an old Chiricahua man looked politely at the horizon. You gave me a family, she said. When I had none, you did not have to, no one would have, and now you go find the rest of it, I said. That's not leaving your family. That's your family getting bigger. That's the best thing that can happen to a family, is it turns out there's more of it than you thought. You think I want you to sit in my kitchen out of pity while your own blood's up in those mountains waiting? What kind of family would that be? Go. That's an order, and it's the last one I'll ever give you, and you'd best obey it, since you're so big on choosing what to obey. She laughed. Through the crying she laughed, the fullest laugh I ever got out of her, the last one, and I've kept it, I keep it still. I take it out on the cold nights. She left 3 days later. I loaded that horse till it sagged. She tried to refuse half of it. I do not take Sela's, and I said, it's not taking, it's provisioning. It's what you do for family that's headed out on a hard road, and you'll take it and shut up about it or I'll be insulted. And she took it. At the top of the road where it bends behind the ridge and you're gone from the house's sight, she stopped. She turned the horse. She looked back, one backward look, the one I'd told her she didn't owe, and she gave anyway, gave it to me on purpose, I understood, as a gift, a thing I could keep. She didn't wave. She wasn't a waving kind. She just looked a long moment across all that distance. And she touched her own chest, the way she had the day she gave me her name, Deganawida, the name that broke in my mouth, the whole true name she'd never made me try to say. Then she rode over the ridge and was gone. That was 11 years ago. I never heard from her again. There was no reason I should. Where she went there was no mail, No roads a letter could travel, and to send word out was to risk being found, and being found meant San Carlos or worse. Her silence was her safety, and I learned, slow, to love her silence for that reason, to hope it was the good kind, to build a whole faith on the back of never knowing. I don't know if she made it. Some nights I'm sure she did, I can see it. Her coming into a high camp in the last light, and an old woman rising and knowing her across the fire. The family bigger than she'd thought, just like I'd promised. Some nights I'm not sure at all, and the country between here and those mountains is cruel. And she was one woman on one horse. And I lie awake and do the old arithmetic, and it doesn't balance, and it will never balance, and I've had to learn to live in a ledger that doesn't close. Cutter's been gone 9 years. Died in his sleep across the Linta threshold where he'd kept sleeping even after she left, waiting. I buried him out by the well. Seemed right. It's where the whole thing started. I'm an old man now. The barn we raised the second time still stands, better than the first. Holly's died and I miss him. The valleys mostly forgot there was ever an Apache woman out at Boone's place, and the ones who remember have mostly decided to remember it soft, which is what people do. But here's the thing I set out to tell you, all this long way. The reason I've told it at all. I offered her a family because I thought she was the one with nothing. I stood in that yard that first gray morning feeling like a rich man handing alms to the poor, a man with a house and land and a full life, offering a scrap of it to a woman who'd lost everything. I had it exactly backwards. I was the one with nothing, a closed account, a balanced ledger and an empty house and a dog that had stopped wagging its tail. I'd buried my wife and called the burying life and gone on adding up fence posts for 5 dead years. She arrived with nothing but heartbreak, and heartbreak, it turns out, is not nothing. Heartbreak is proof you loved something all the way down. She came carrying the evidence of a whole life fully lived and fully loved and terribly lost, and I looked at that and mistook it for emptiness, when it was the fullest thing that ever crossed my land. I offered her a family. She's the one who taught me I'd been a member of the human one all along and had just quit showing up. I still don't keep the ledger, haven't touched it in 13 years, but I kept the book. It's on the shelf by the fire, closed, and some nights I take it down and don't open it, just hold it, the way you'd warm your hand at a fire you can't get closer to. And I think about a woman at the top of a road, turning her horse, giving me one backward look I told her she didn't owe. I hope the family was bigger than she thought. I hope she's an old woman now, somewhere high and free, telling children about the ravens who are only old men complaining about their knees. I hope